welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely shift your paradigm on exactly why you might be feeling stuck, overwhelmed, or just completely paralyzed by your own high standards. We've taken decades of psychological research, neuroscience, and clinical therapy data and boiled it all down to figure out what perfectionism actually is, why it holds you back, and most importantly, how you can finally break free. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's kick things off with this incredibly counterintuitive quote from neuroscientist and psychiatrist Dr. Judd Brewer. The higher your standards, the less you do. Man, that perfectly captures the deeply frustrating reality of just staring blankly at a page, doesn't it? We usually assume that wanting things to be perfect makes us work harder. But let's be real, if you've ever completely reorganized your desk instead of actually starting that big project, you know the truth. Perfectionism doesn't drive you forward. It's actually the exact thing keeping you stuck. We so often fall into this vicious cycle known as the 3 Ps. It always starts with perfectionism, setting an impossibly how goal based on rigid black and white thinking. Your brain basically convinces you that if a project isn't absolutely flawless, well, then it's just a complete failure. And that intense, heavy pressure triggers the second P, procrastination. You know the drill. We delay starting until the perfect time. But because that perfect time literally never comes, we hit the final P, paralysis. The whole project just grinds to a total halt. So let's move right into section 1, dimensions of perfectionism. Because perfectionism really isn't just one single, simple trait. Let's break down the 3 distinct dimensions that researchers have identified that keep us in this trap.
The first dimension is self-oriented perfectionism. Think of this as your classic inner critic, just working brutal overtime. This is where your self-worth becomes entirely, completely tied to your achievements. Making a mistake doesn't just feel like a temporary bump in the road, it feels like a massive personal inadequacy. You end up obsessed with checking and rechecking your work simply because you feel like your absolute best is never, ever good enough.
Then we have socially prescribed perfectionism. Now, this dimension is what drives that intense people-pleasing and procrastination, and it all stems from a deep, deep fear of public failure. It's that persistent, heavy belief that other people are going to reject you if they see your flaws. And what happens? It leads you to hide your authentic self just to avoid any negative evaluation.
Finally, there's other-oriented perfectionism. This is when you take those impossibly high standards and project them outward onto everybody else. It leads to micromanaging, an inability to delegate, and just intense frustration with the people around you. You basically feel that if you have to maintain these exhausting high standards, well, everyone else should be able to as well. So here is the absolutely crucial point: understanding the real difference between your standards and your fears. Research by Dr. Joachim Stober and others shows us that wanting to do excellent work, what they call your perfectionistic strivings, actually helps you. It's an adaptive and energizing trait. But the perfectionistic concerns, that maladaptive, super harsh self-criticism and intense fear of evaluation, that is the exact thing paralyzing you. And this is backed up by a massive meta-analysis of 43 different studies. It brilliantly illustrates the stark difference in motivation here. Perfectionistic strivings are driven by aspiration, and get this, they actually decrease procrastination. Perfectionistic concerns, on the other hand, are driven purely by fear. This proves that the common advice of, hey, just lower your standards, completely misses the mark. Your standards aren't the issue at all. It is purely the fear of not being good enough that triggers your avoidance. Which brings us nicely to section 2, the fixed mindset trap. Because this fear of failure, it doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's deeply rooted in how we fundamentally view our own intelligence and abilities. Stanford psychologist Dr. Carol Dweck's foundational research shows that having a fixed mindset makes us believe our talent is basically set in stone. If you have a fixed mindset, you actively avoid challenges just to protect your ego, because any failure feels like permanent proof of your limitations. On the flip side, a growth mindset embraces failure as critical data. It's the core belief that your abilities are actively developed through effort and strategy. And here's why this is such a game changer for you right now. Neuroscience proves that our brains remain highly plastic throughout adulthood. Brain imaging actually shows that individuals using a growth mindset light up areas of the brain involved in learning and error correction. This means there is no doubt about it. You absolutely can rewire these paralyzing, fixed thought patterns with practice. Okay, let's explore section 3, breaking the habit loop. We're going to see how this avoidance actually builds into a psychological cycle that you can systematically dismantle.
Think about it. Procrastination basically runs on an autopilot loop. The trigger is a task where you might be judged. The behavior is delaying. But here is the secret sauce. The reward is that not starting actually keeps your self-image perfectly safe. As long as you delay, you get to keep the comfortable fantasy alive that you could have done it perfectly if you had just tried. It's a short-term emotional relief, but it comes at the massive cost of your long-term progress. To break this exact loop, Dr. Judd Brewer recommends shifting through 3 gears. First, map the trigger. Literally write down the exact task you're avoiding. Second, get fiercely, genuinely curious about the physical feeling of your fear. Is it a tight chest? A clenched jaw? Realize that the so-called safety of avoiding the task actually feels pretty terrible in your body. Finally, offer your brain a much better reward. Swap that fear for curiosity. Ask yourself, hey, what part of this task actually interests me? To really nail that, we move to section 4, unhooking from rigid thoughts. Along with curiosity, we can borrow some highly effective evidence-based tools from acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, to finally quiet that loud inner critic.
ACT relies heavily on this brilliant concept called cognitive diffusion. Basically, cognitive diffusion teaches us that our thoughts are just thoughts. They are absolutely not undeniable facts that get to dictate our behavior. So, when your brain is screaming, if I can't do it perfectly, I shouldn't do it at all, diffusion helps you observe that thought from a healthy distance, completely stripping it of its power over you. You can actually practice diffusion today using a few incredibly simple steps. First, label the thought. Try saying, I am having the thought that I will fail, instead of just, I will fail. Second, actually humorously thank your mind for its help. Just say, thanks for the anxiety, brain, but I've got this. And third, visualize those harsh, perfectionistic judgments simply floating away like leaves on a stream. Now, a massive part of perfectionism is just running away from uncomfortable emotions. So instead of avoiding those painful feelings of shame or anxiety, practice what ACT calls emotion expansion. Simply name the feeling, like, okay, this is anxiety, and breathe directly into the part of your body where you feel it. Make a little space for it. Treat it as a temporary visitor until it passes on its own. And finally, we reach section 5. Embracing imperfect action. Because by confronting the discomfort and actually making space for it, we can finally cross the threshold into true, meaningful action. Doing this requires shifting your focus away from what others might think and instead confidently asking yourself what you actually want your life to stand for. Identify your core values. Maybe it's creativity, connection, or personal growth. Then empower yourself to start taking small, committed steps that align with those deeply held personal values, rather than just endlessly striving for some impossible standard of flawlessness. Always remember to separate your true self-worth from the pure results of your tasks. When you adopt a growth mindset, you quickly recognize that a flawed project is really just a stepping stone. It's just helpful data for your next attempt. It is not, and never will be, a reflection of your fundamental identity. Like the saying goes, there are no mistakes, there are only learning experiences. I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to challenge your avoidance loop today. What if you purposefully did something terribly right now just to prove to yourself that you can? What if you sat down and wrote the absolute worst first draft possible, completely on purpose? It might just be the exact key you need to break the spell of perfectionism, dismantle your fear, and finally start making real progress. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I challenge you to go out there and make a glorious mess of something today.